Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Recovery Couch. Today I'm with a dear friend of mine and we're going to talk about a topic that I think really needs some light shed on it. The topic of sex and pornography. I know that this topic has played a significant role in my life. Sex and pornography shaped a false self, a false identity in me. And the guest I'm bringing on today has done phenomenal research on these topics to help us understand why do we struggle with things that we don't want to struggle with. As Paul wrote in the New Testament, why do we have these thorns in our side? And so I've met this gentleman at Southbrook Christian Church. I've sat in some recovery rooms with him. And to be completely honest, there were times where his healing triggered my hurt because he was discussing things that he was healing from and that I wasn't willing to bring to the light. So I was still hurting and his healing was triggering my hurt. And since I've got to know Joel Metz, welcome to the show. Man, it's a pleasure to have you. I love the work you've done in the recovery field as it pertains to pornography and sexual addiction. I've been looking at and watching your presentation called Porn on the Brain and in the Church. Mm-hmm. Now, you've done a lot of research regarding Christians and pornography, and you have a pretty good understanding of the statistics of the amount of Christians in the market research on the Christians who have dabbled in pornography. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I would say that it's not so much me that's done the actual research and surveys, but there's a group called the Barna Group that for a decade has been studying the church's relationship with, pornography, among other things. And they've kind of presented that information to the community, to churches. I think that's the intent, is to try to get churches to be aware of what's going on. And these aren't statistics that I've memorized, but the overall trend of that research is essentially says that a majority of men in the church, this is single, this is married, do use pornography on a pretty regular basis. And the majority feel like their church doesn't talk about it enough or doesn't have enough resources. I believe ours does. I think Pastor Charlie does a great job of talking about recovery issues and is very comfortable talking about addiction from the pulpit. And I think that's a beautiful thing. The research that the Barna Group has done, and I'm sure they're probably still doing it just because these things are changing. The research they did 10 years ago is actually showing us that use of porn is actually on the rise. It also is pointing out that the majority of Christians, I think 62%, think that it's not an issue for them. Like, it's not going to affect their faith. It's not going to affect their relationship with God or others. So there's pretty obviously a significant amount of denial there among those people that fortunately answered that survey. Honestly, we have to think that people, if anything, are probably going to underestimate their use or consumption of pornography in those sorts of studies, because there's naturally an inclination to hide that and not talk about it. It's not the type of thing that people talk about, at lunch, with their good friends. So people naturally hide. And even on anonymous surveys, I think it's pretty clear that people still dial it back a little bit in terms of the level of honesty. Like, how often do I use it? We tend to think, until we can look at ourselves kind of in black and white, we tend to sugarcoat our view of ourselves because it's actually just too painful to sort of confront it. People almost always underestimate, how often they do such and such a thing if there's some shame surrounded to it. So the research essentially is telling us that the majority of men in the church, and there's a rising percentage of women also, are exposed in using pornography on a pretty regular basis.
And I've heard you attribute that to the availability of pornography in our society. I think one of the illustrations you used when addressing this topic at a prior event, you were saying in the 60s, probably even 70s, you would have to go into shady parts of town, risk being seen to get pornography. But today, there's a way that you can kind of isolate and almost hide and watch pornography, and then the availability, not just to us as adults, like it was when they used to check your ID in those shady parts of town, but to the children. And the fact that the enemy is using pornography against such an early generation of young people. So how do you think the availability of pornography plays into the equation of the rising number of Christians who are experiencing it?
I think it has everything to do with it. There's porn is freely. There's 3 A words. So you mentioned one already, which is available. It's also basically completely anonymous, and it's completely affordable. It's completely free. It doesn't always stay that way. Some people, find ways to spend money on it. But, can you imagine if anything that, gave you that type of reaction met all 3 of those criteria? Can you imagine if you could actually like pull opioids out of your computer completely anonymously and without any cost, almost like you could 3D print it? I mean, can you imagine what that epidemic would look like?
Sure.
If you didn't have to have a dealer anymore, you know what I mean? It just could appear. It has everything to do with it. And there's some debate about it, but I've seen some estimates that as much as 50% of internet traffic is actually related to sex of some kind, pornography, and all sorts of, anything that's kind of adjacent to pornography. But I've seen some estimates as low as, in the 30%, so it's such a common way the internet is actually used that, anything that has that type of physiologic response, porn, creates a physiologic and a brain response that's many, many more times what is normal, so to speak. And the way that affects the brain is just fundamentally disruptive to how the brain works. And it actually, in a way, we use terms like it rewires the brains. Of course, there's no wires in our brain, but there are all these nerves that have these connections. And all these connections are designed to either work really well or not work that well. And just like an athlete hones his skill and he practices his free throws and he practices, his 3-point shot, he's going to get better at it because those nerves are essentially becoming superhighways in that kid's brain. Well, when I go to pornography over and over again, which, I think the dawn of the internet was when I was a teenager, and I got a job where I learned how to make computers, and I was working at like a video rental store, but they also did computer repair, and I learned how to do it. I built my own computer. I talked my mom into getting, America Online, some internet access. And, I found essentially an unlimited supply of pornography, which up to that point, I would have had to have kind of gone to like a friend's house who had a dad who just, kind of had it around. And I had a couple of friends like that. I think a lot of people do. And that was like my first exposure. But, once I could access it myself, the number of exposures was just multiplied. And then what's that's doing to the brain? Well, it's turning me into like the Kobe Bryant of, pornography. I'm just like, I can do this stuff all day. It gives me a lot of immediate satisfaction, but it's also rewiring my brain to go to that, to go to it when I want to feel better, to go to it when I'm feeling stressed. And it starts becoming a substitute for me, like actually living my life, interacting with people, not to mention just processing difficult emotions. I didn't know how to do that until I got into recovery in my 30s. I'm 43 now.
So what you're saying is that if life was throwing you curveballs and presenting you with difficult situations, you knew you could escape to something that was just going to shift your focus to pleasure.
Yeah. And I don't even know if I would have had the language for it back then. Like, to be able to admit that I'm stressed out and I'm looking for help all by itself, I think that requires a certain level of emotional maturity to even kind of realize that you're kind of going to your medicine. You know what I mean? So it happens without, in my opinion, for me anyway, it happened without my ability to even explain it. You know what I mean? So instead of like, expressing interest in the girls I liked at school, the fear of rejection, the fear that interest wouldn't be reciprocated, I bottled that up and I went to like the source of the source of dopamine that was risk-free, essentially. You know what I mean? It wasn't, it couldn't reject me. I knew that. And so, I became really risk averse when it came to how I lived my life. That affected everything from like career to just education and things like that. But on an individual level, like that would keep me from trying to meet even just friends, even just like platonic male friends. Like I was extremely isolated. I had some friends in school, but like they were much more acquaintances. They were like, hey, we were kind of like the thing we could relate with most was like we weren't on the inside, that we were kind of the outsiders, and you know we could do well on our tests and kind of knew that we could kind of like make a career for ourselves, but we knew that high school was not the peak of our life. So, we would isolate from the young ladies that were around us that might have been interested in, a relationship of some kind. And that just continued later into my life, because why change from a sure thing? If you've got a sure thing, you're a little whoopee blanket, that's always going to bring you comfort. Why ever go away from it? You know what I mean? If it's always going to be there.
So, and I thank you for those illustrations. That's one of the things I love about listening to you speak, especially on this topic, is your ability to illustrate. You have a really good working knowledge of the way that this works in our brains neurologically. Why, from a dopamine perspective, which you just mentioned, does the human brain, not just your brain or my brain, but the way God wired us anatomically and physiologically, why do our brains tend to go to those comfort zones? Medicines.
I think if our brains weren't wired that way, I think human beings would never explore. I think human beings would never try to make something new. I think human beings, wouldn't, feel like there was anything to kind of like fight for in life. And, one of God's earliest commands was like, was to kind of spread over the earth and kind of make dominion over it. And there's a lot of risk in that, and I think without the way our brains are wired, like, hey, we probably wouldn't even reproduce, you know what I mean? Like we would kind of like live our life, and, I don't even know what we would do if that part of the brain, that dopamine part of the brain wasn't there. I think we wouldn't grow as a species. I think we wouldn't explore. I think we wouldn't try to create medicines to cure problems, so I think there's a legitimate purpose for how we're wired that way. We're also, I think, wired to seek God, in my opinion. Atheists and skeptics might disagree, but everybody, I think, is looking for something. And there's a podcast I love called the Being Known podcast. It's by Kurt Thompson. And, he says that's always struck me, and I highly recommend it. But he says everybody comes into this world looking for someone looking for them. And that applies to relationships like this one right now. The types of relationships where we can become a little bit more known than we were before. And when we do that, when we take that risk of like being known by you, being known by your listeners, being known by the people that we meet in recovery and in life, that includes, potential mates, and they don't turn their backs on us. There's like, in my mind, there's not a better feeling than that, when porn ruined my first marriage, but about 4 years ago, I got remarried. And when I was seeing my wife at this point, I'd already been through recovery and was seeing victory over those compulsive, behaviors that I was, in bondage to for the first, 20, 30 years of my life. And I explained myself to my wife. I said, here's my story. Here's what it's looked like. And I don't want you to be handcuffed to me before you know this. I don't want you to be overly bonded to me before you know about me. And when I revealed my heart, my history, the highs, the lows, all the dirty stuff, anything that if she found out about later, that could shock her, I wasn't going to let that happen. Now, that's not the way I handled the courtship with my first wife, not by a long shot. But when I did that, and then in recovery, if I go back a little bit further and I think about, I did a Christian 12-step program. And when I did my moral inventory and I shared it with the guys in my group that I shared it with, and I heard them express empathy, I heard them express love and kindness towards me, that they were proud of me for sharing that. I had a counselor when I was preparing a disclosure for my ex-wife who said he was proud of me for doing that. And that touched me because I never had let myself be known well enough to actually hear and receive words like that earlier in my life. So anytime I got positive affirmation, be that in school or whatever, like I was always discounting it. I was always like, oh, if you really knew me, that you wouldn't be saying that. But here in recovery, and then with my wife, me sharing those things and receiving love, that was how I began to believe that God could love me like that too. I was never under any kind of misguided idea that God didn't know about what I had done, but I always doubted that he really loved me the way that, John 3:16 says he did. And I figured, there's something that just doesn't feel right about that for me. I don't feel like I can believe it. And you could look at my actions and they would have said the same thing. They would have said, this guy, even though he grew up in the church, someone that saw everything I did, be like, he doesn't believe it. You know what I mean? And when I finally, and the moral inventory is not an easy undertaking, and it's not something I would suggest someone do like right out the gate when they're starting to work in this, because they need to kind of know that there's trustworthy people around them first, people that kind of have been there and done that before, kind of like wingmen. But when I did that, and when I did that with my wife, and especially when I did it with my brothers in recovery, that's when the God became real to me. That's when, that's when he started looking like Jesus. Before that, he looked a lot more like my dad, which was someone that wasn't around, someone that, kind of set sexual accomplishment at sort of the pinnacle of being a man. You know what I mean? And an athletic accomplishment. And I kind of just felt like I didn't measure up, and he wasn't around a lot. So I figured God was kind of like that too. I unintentionally put, my dad's face on God. And I didn't realize it, because it's not something that I realized until like I started to unpack it.
It's another great illustration. And I think I share that with you, Joel, of I couldn't even love myself at one point in time. How could, God love me to the point where he would send his only son? So like I said, man, I love your ability to illustrate.
This episode of the Recovery Couch is brought to you by J.B. Davis at Performance Chrysler Jeep Dodge Ram in Centerville. I know JB personally, and I can tell you firsthand, he's the real deal. You can trust him and his team to treat you with honesty, respect, and top-tier service. If you're looking for a new or used ride, call JB today at 937-709-0941. That's 937-709-0941, and tell him the Recovery Couch sent you.
So help us understand. You may, when I watched your presentation that you did with the Southbrook counselors, you build a bridge connecting what, this type of these dopamine receptors and the opioid receptors, and how basically there's these stimuli that a lot of human beings, pay attention to, eat, whatever, that bind to these receptors in our brains, and neurologically, like, we just become kind of addicted to that dopamine rush.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so dopamine is, and so this is a presentation I gave, and I'm not a neuroscientist. I am in healthcare, and I've got a good education, so I know enough about this stuff, but neuroscience isn't exactly my area of expertise. So I'm borrowing the expertise of others to a degree here. And so I hope anybody that knows more than me, will be graceful if I am, fudging things a little bit or mistaking things a little bit. But, one of the important, neurotransmitters in our brain is dopamine. This is why we seek out things. This is, when we eat a donut that has like, that right combination of sugar and fat in it, it just tastes phenomenal. And we kind of want another one. That's dopamine. That, we got a lot of dopamine from that experience. And then, then the neurochemical goes away. And suddenly that nerve synapse, the place where those two nerves meet, is suddenly like, as like this dramatically lower level of it. And I kind of want another one. And, this goes for like, the cigarette smoker, it goes for the, the coffee drinker, it goes for the online shopper. It goes for, I think I was at work yesterday, and I think I had like these brief lulls in my day. And I think I pulled up the internet browser on my computer, like probably a dozen times without even knowing what I was going to do with it. I would just pull it up and be like, oh, wait, I kind of already looked at ESPN today. There's nothing new, but like, I didn't even know what I was pulling it up for. And there's this great quote here that says, this is by a psychologist named Susan Weinschenk, and she explained in this article in 2009, she says, dopamine causes us to want, desire, seek out, and search, she wrote. It is the opioid system that causes one to feel pleasure. Yet the dopamine system is stronger than the opioid system, she explained. We seek more than we are satisfied, and these experiences with this search, with our search for whatever it is that really kind of rings our bells the strongest. For me, that was pornography and things, of sexual nature. It causes rewiring of our brain. Some experts explain that, like, when we get these extremely high releases of dopamine, which I certainly got when I was exposed to pornography, that it is actually, our brain might even consider this almost a dangerous type of exposure. Like, oh, this is like way more than we're wired for. And so the brain actually diminishes its sensitivity to that stimulus. And this was explained to me as a kind of a self-protective mechanism. But to the person who's seeking that out, it kind of just feels like, oh, well, that didn't feel as good as it did the first time. And my brain then sort of like starts to try to conceive of ways of for achieving the same thing or better than what I'd already experienced. But because my brain is now less sensitive, this is called desensitization, I now have to seek out a much stronger version of it, either a greater exposure, greater duration, more frequent, or, in the case of pornography, that might cause the person struggling with that behavior to look for different things, the darker, the better, because it's like that, the forbidden nature of it, it actually increases the dopamine response, which is pretty wild.
So they're searching either for more after. So once they go the first time, the second time, they're either going to search for more, or maybe even something in the porn world known as kinkier or more perverse.
Yeah. Yeah. And we see, I think it's pretty obvious that you can see that play out outside of pornography too. There's all sorts of individuals that, that behavior grows outside of the consumption of pornography into other, illicit behaviors, and it has its hands on, I think, everything from human trafficking, which is, takes all different forms. But, I think there's literally human slaves all over our own country, let alone in other parts of the world that don't necessarily have as strong of a legal system, because pornography is like fuel, like kind of feeding that fire of sort of like seeking, searching, and sort of discounting the needs of others, and in exchange for my, trying to fulfill my own needs.
Cross the bridge between those dopamine receptors and like just a drug addict or alcoholic, and how are those similar to somebody in porn or sex addiction?
Yeah, there's been some scientists that have actually compared, for example, cocaine use and what that does structurally to the brain, and looked at pornography use and found that the way it affects the brain, specifically the way it sort of disconnects our frontal lobe, which is the part of our brain that sort of is the judge. Our frontal lobe is kind of like the brake of our brain. It says that's wrong. You can't do that. You know what I mean? Like, well, I really want a PS5. Why can't I just go steal one? You know what I mean? Why can't I just go draw a gun at the local, store and steal one? Well, I mean, the same thing goes for anything that we want. But a drug is obviously it's an example of another super normal stimuli. This is actually a term that's coined by a Nobel Prize winner, and his name is Nicholas Tinbergen. And it says an artificially exaggerated stimulus that triggers a stronger response in an organism compared to a natural stimulus it would normally encounter. Cocaine comes from heroin comes from a plant. These things kind of have you think about everything from marijuana to tobacco, all these things kind of exist in our world in a certain natural form. I don't know what that means about, in a spiritual sense, what it means that these things kind of exist. But like, obviously the way these substances are sort of like processed into these forms is obviously intended to create a more powerful response than like, just being exposed to the plant would have caused by itself. And, it's the same for all of them. It's it's the same for the gambler that's getting dopamine from gambling, the pornography, the person searching up pornography. These things they're all causing these super normal stimuli in the brain that are kind of beginning to rewire the brain. We see desensitization in the form of the nerves requiring higher levels of stimulus. We also see called hypofrontality, where that frontal lobe, the judgment part of our brain, is sort of fired. It's like our limbic system, like sort of the dopamine centric parts of the brain that are really involved with these responses, is sort of telling the frontal lobe, butt out, we're trying to have a good time. And eventually the addict actually, loses, not permanently, but loses some of his ability to judge and discern a situation. That's not wise. It's not that's not a healthy person for me to hang around. This is not a healthy thing for me to keep doing. There might be moments where the addict sort of has a conception of that, but by and large, his or her frontal lobe is just not welcome at the table anymore.
This episode is sponsored by Greg Swartz at Remax Victory and Affiliates. Whether you're buying your first home, selling, or making a move, Greg brings integrity, expertise, and heart to every step of the journey. He's not just a realtor, he's a trusted guide who puts your needs first. Call Greg today at 937-477-8975 and let him help you find your next home. And don't forget to tell him the Recovery Couch sent you.
So are you saying that once somebody with an addictive personality lowers their inhibitions enough times that they kind of lose their ability to just have discernment on situations that aren't good for them?
Sure. It's not a complete loss, but it's definitely diminished. It's definitely diminished. And, because we can't, I believe I'm responsible for all the choices that I made. Ted Roberts from Pure Desire Ministries puts it this way: what started as a moral failure it stopped becoming a moral failure, and it started becoming a brain problem. I had a broken brain. So it started as a moral issue, but it's no longer so much about me not being able to discern right from wrong. It's about my brain has just really been it's just not functioning anymore quite the way it was. And so this isn't a license for the addict to continue doing what he or she is doing, and it's not, but it is also important to realize that, the shame that a lot of addicts will even kind of experience themselves, even without an outside voice telling him, that, there's something wrong with you. Even if that voice isn't external, it often is coming from the addict, him or herself, because we can't help but see how our lives are going, and we're witness to it, we're experiencing it. And we kind of realize we're creating a lot of damage, not only for ourselves, but for those around us, for our families, especially. But the idea, of, hey, this is fixable. I just need to go talk to so-and-so. I need to get some help. Those sorts of thoughts are just not really going to be natural to the addict, I think, nor are they going to just even seem realistic. You know what I mean? Like that part of my brain that wants to protect itself, that says, hey, if anybody knew about what I've been doing, how long I've been doing it, all the lies that I've told, the people that I've betrayed, if people really knew that, it'd be over for me. I got to protect that. So that self-protective part of my brain is going to sort of really discourage me from seeking help and being honest with people, because even though I'm a big believer that there is help and hope for the addict, and that help is there, and it worked for me. I didn't know that at the time. I was in a situation where I didn't really see I had another option, and I saw my life was falling apart. And I just said, I eventually got to the point where I said, I don't know what's best for me anymore. I'm going to have to trust someone else to tell me what I need to do, someone who's been there and done it before. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about recovery, is that there was people there for me in that way.
Let me see if I can put a bow on everything you were just saying. So the first time I listened to you speak on this topic, you talked about the neuroplasticity, how it's like a game of Tetris. Is that similar to what you're saying now? And then on top of that, you got a little deeper into the shame and the guilt that people eventually feel once they make enough bad decisions. Even though it started moral, it ended with a brain problem. So even though it's past just an immoral decision, this is now like a neurological issue that we should have empathy for. But until they have a situation like you had with your now wife, where you were able to be honest and vulnerable, and that eventually equaled freedom and liberation from your bondage, until they're able to do that, then their brain's just going to continue playing this game of Tetris.
Yeah. So that Tetris metaphor, I didn't invent that, but if you've ever played the game, and not just been a natural prodigy at it, you've probably experienced the idea where you're kind of doing okay at the beginning, and you're able to kind of get some of those lines eliminated, but then the shapes start coming a bit faster, and they start getting higher and higher, and it just turns into a mess, right? So our brain is plastic, which just means it's malleable. You know what I mean? It's changes. And, we're left with, our brain is always in its most kind of recent setting. You know what I mean? It's always, we don't really have a way to functionally hit the reset button, be like, hey, let's just take the brain back to, what it was like, when I was last in the shop, you know what I mean, 2011 or whatever that was. We just can't do that. And it kind of unwinds itself slowly, it kind of has to be unwound from the outside going down. So yeah, those decisions that we make, the actions that we take, the shame responses we're getting, the more we feel isolated from those around us, the more harm that we're doing to ourselves and those around us. I believe that changes us, and for many addicts, that makes it so we end up with this really busted game of Tetris that hopefully my circumstances have brought me to that point where I'm exposed to someone that can help and that has empathy, for the addict. And that's one of the beautiful things about the 12th step in the 12-step program, is that there's people there that are, interested in doing that for us, I think.
And in order to get to the 12th step, you kind of got to start with the first step, which is I'm powerless. And that is, I think, to this whole neuroplasticity, understand the fact that we can hopefully eventually be able to say, like, I know I started with an immoral decision. I shouldn't have went to that website, but for some unfortunate reason, it has addicted me, and I am completely powerless over my ability to manage.
Yeah, the way when I learned about this stuff, I'd already known I had a problem for around 6 years. And then I watched this video series called the Conquer series. And this was done right when I had begun to actually surrender at the deepest level. And I was exposed to this information, and it was such a relief to me, Brandon, to hear that not only that I could change, but that there was a reason why, like, my choices just looked so insane for as long as they did. And it gave me like a breath of fresh air. It's like I was drowning in shame. And when I learned about some of this information, it was like a breath of fresh air. And I took in a big, deep breath of grace. And that was the breath that I needed, kind of like a swimmer. That was the breath I needed to, like, trudge forward into the program of recovery that I was in.
So when you take that big gasp of grace, you feel like that fueled you enough to be able to push forward and, like, okay, I can be completely honest about where in the areas of my life where there's so much guilt and shame, I never thought I was going to be able to be vulnerable.
Yeah. And I need breaths of grace pretty often, just like, that oxygen is not going to last forever. I think that's why you hear that recovery aphorism so often, one day at a time, is because I'm going to need that. I'm going to need something like that grace again tomorrow or next week in a pretty significant way. And hopefully at that time, I've made more human connections with people in recovery, that I have even more resources than I had the week before, the day before, that there's those wells of grace that I can go back to, and I can draw from those again and again, because I'm going to keep needing it. You know what I mean? Like, at that point, the Tetris mess is really only just beginning to kind of come undone. So that mess of a brain is going to continue to probably make some poor decisions. And I'm going to continue to kind of get myself in trouble a little bit. Like, as I was waiting for my first marriage to hopefully heal and recover, I was getting so frustrated that it wasn't getting better at the pace that I was hoping that it would. Because I thought, here I am, Joel, finally doing the right thing after years of marriage and years of putting that poor woman through misery. I was finally doing the right thing, and I thought she would be able to tell that it was different this time. But I'd put her through so much that she wasn't willing to kind of come back to the table, so to speak, for a long time. And it was so frustrating. And there were so many times that I was putting my foot directly in my mouth, with kind of essentially expressing that expectation, like, hey, if I'm making the right decisions, then things should go well for me. Well, our actions have consequences. You can't avoid that altogether. And they're going to continue to affect me on a certain level. But the nice thing about that law is that my good decisions, my healthy decisions, are also eventually going to have consequences in a very good way. But the negative ones don't disappear right away. So, I still stuck my foot in my mouth and made poor decisions, really hoping my marriage and my circumstances were going to get better a little bit quicker. I was still finding myself in situations where my stinking thinking was getting me into some trouble, not necessarily with acting out, but all the sideways sorts of ways, the ways of, expectations and arguing and just not getting along with people, feeling frustrated. All those things obviously would have originally sent me back to my medicine. And so I think God kind of wants us to have those moments of sometimes frustration and stress in the recovery environment, because God, I think, wants to train me how to have different responses from that point forward. He wants to train me to reach out for wisdom to those around me. There's a proverb that says, if you fall in the ditch, if you're walking along a road and you fall in a ditch and you don't have anybody to help you, you're screwed, essentially. But if you've got someone there, he can pull you out. There's another beautiful proverb that says, rope or a cord of 3 strands does not break easily. So I needed to learn how to rely on people and how to go to healthy people with my problems. And that's how my brain ultimately got rewired, as I learned how to deal with problems in a new way. And it almost always involved, I need wise people in my life to kind of help me, because I don't know how to do it yet.
So Paul tells us in Romans 12:2 that we will be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about now. So the Tetris blocks were built all the way up. And the only way that you were able to find, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joel, is that you were able to find the peace that you were surrendering to was by finding community of people who were filled with grace, that were going to love you regardless of what you told them, which was the truth. And once you had people that would lift you out of that ditch, when you fell in it with grace and with love, that's when the Tetris pieces just started.
Yeah. And it's the same experience of grace I mentioned before. We're like, hey, this is actually what God looks like. He looks like patience. He looks like mercy. He looks like a source of wisdom that I can go to, and that's when the face of God started to look different for me. And I started to experience, wow, there are some solutions to my issues and problems that really weren't I couldn't bring them out of my own brain. You know what I mean? It wasn't there for me to bring out yet. And people kind of I had to see other people process some of those issues. And I think, one of the beautiful things about recovery groups is it's almost like the more honest we're being, the more we're loved. That was my experience. I'm not sure if it's been that way.
I love that, dude. Yeah. I love that. You're absolutely right. Not just me when I'm being more honest, like when I see somebody else be more honest, the more I love. Yeah, I love it. Yeah. Love it. It's attractive. And what I compare it to, I was just saying this, I think at my men's group on Wednesday, is, scripture tells us that we are strong when we are weak, but I don't feel strong when I'm weak. But when I see somebody else be vulnerable and weak, I see them as strong.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
100%. Yeah. Is that beautiful?
It's so beautiful.
It's like God designed us for community. I've heard some wise people say the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's relationship. And so getting to see, your brother in recovery, your brother in Christ, be honest and vulnerable in that way, you're like, wow, I'm blown away, by the guts that it took you to do that, to see this and actually deal with it and not run away from it. And just God's kingdom is just upside down. It doesn't make sense sometimes. It makes sense, like in hindsight, but it doesn't always make sense when you're in the middle of it.
It didn't for me. And I think the freedom came when it was like, my soul is being crushed by this bondage that I will not talk about. And I shared it in small doses at first, Joel, because I was trying to, it was image control, if I'm being honest. I wanted people to see me a certain way. I didn't want them to see me as broken, lonely, or afraid. Yeah. But that's what I really was. Yeah. And trying to control my image, I would feed somebody. And you talked about the trustworthiness of the recovery. You would not encourage somebody to just come out of the gates with a fearless moral inventory until you kind of realize some trustworthy people. And so I would small dose a little bit of my bondage and see if it would get mishandled, which was not the right way to do it. And I wish I would have just kind of had this discussion and that bit of wisdom, early in my recovery. But it's, if I would have had that, Joel, then I wouldn't have had to rely on God the way and pray and go to him as often as I have.
I think we're both still early in our recovery, to be honest with you. Like, I finished my 12th step in terms of like my original program. I think it was in 2018, but I still think I'm still learning things all the time. And, there's things I'm learning now that I wouldn't have been able to learn in 2018. and things that only make sense based on the breadth of my life so far and my experience of God and my experience of other people. We're both still learning, I think. And I think that's why people that are actually practicing the 12th step of like trying to pass along the benefits of recovery to those that are still stuck in it and wrestling with it, is that it often helps the sponsor or the mentor more than it actually helps the brand new guy. And I think, what does that say about God? Like, if this is how God operates, then who is he? Like, how good is he that he kind of designed us this way, for things just to get better and better, the more we draw to each other and the more we help each other, the more we connect, the more I connect to you and you to me, that, he makes both of our lives so much better and our days so much better. I could be dealing with something really hard, but it takes one good conversation with someone, or even just me, finding I can help this guy, and suddenly like my day is completely turned around sometimes.
The connection. I think it's his way of connecting through each other, connecting us to him.
Yeah.
And letting us know how important the community is. So, man, what a great discussion. I've gained so much from this. I hope you guys have too. Any last words for anybody out there that might be feeling like they are dealing with too much guilt or too much shame to be honest, open, or vulnerable about any sort of sexual addiction, sexual promiscuity, or pornography addiction that they might have?
There's nothing I think someone could admit to doing at this point that would really shock me enough to turn my back. There's nothing that a person could say that could shock my mentor into being just baffled. And I just pray that anybody that's so stuck inside those shame chains would find a way to tell their story and could experience that grace. I think there's lots of ways to do it. Even if you just wanted to email me, my email is joel.metz@southbrook.org. And you could look up Christ-centered recovery groups. They're all over the world. One avenue is puredesire.org. That is a great ministry that's really Christ-centric, that focuses on the neuroscience aspects and has practical ways for people to experience freedom. There's probably a group near you. Anything from, I did some secular programs for a while, and God is in those too. You know what I mean? He's just not getting the credit, but he's there. The Bible says that God causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. He loves all of his children, and he loves you too. If you're listening and you're feeling that tightness in your chest, that bondage, being in chains to this, he loves you and he wants you to experience freedom. God is not blind to you, and he will put people in your life that can reflect his grace to you. He just wants you to begin to take small steps towards him. And sometimes one of those small steps is finding a local recovery group. I had a conversation with my pastor about a year before I got serious about my recovery, and the grace I experienced just from telling my story to him. I didn't stop my compulsive behavior immediately after that conversation, but it was a very important seed, that was planted, and then that, over time was watered and grew into something that I became more bold in being able to tell my story and actually get connected to the help that I needed.
Yeah, what a way to go out on this conversation. I can't thank you enough for being here. I don't have really anything that I don't want to take away from everything you just said. Give us your email once again if anybody wants to reach out.
Yeah, so you'll probably see my name at the top of the podcast setting, but it's Joel, Joel, .metz, that's M as in Mike, ETZE. It's at southbrook.org. So that's the word south, the word brook.org. So that's my email. I'd be happy to connect with folks. I volunteered at our church's pastoral counseling department because God put in me a hunger to see chains break. And I was like, I got to put myself in the path of this problem, and I gotta find ways to do that. So I'm grateful today because I think God is using you to answer my prayer, Brandon, and because I loved the freedom that I began to experience in my recovery. I loved the grace and love that I began to experience for the first time in my life. It was in recovery that I actually realized that God not only loved me, but he liked me. It wasn't like that distant relative that you kind of are obligated to love, because you're related to them, but he actually chose me. And he liked me, and he didn't make me the way he did. There's no accidents. and he loves everybody that way, which is the beautiful thing about him. It's like, only God can do that. Only something supernatural can actually do that, but he does. And so I love getting to see that light bulb go off with people. And so that's why I got involved with pastoral counseling. It's why I don't mind telling my story. And because I'm not ashamed of the gospel. The gospel is my life. You know, what God did for me and rescued me from my bondage that I was in. I'm already in heaven. You know what I mean? Life isn't perfect, Brandon, but I'm already in it.
Amen.
And I'd be so excited and blessed to get to share that with others. So I hope people listening can begin to believe that.
Knowing Joel the amount of time I've known him, which isn't too terribly long, but long enough to be able to, I feel like be able to say this, that if this message touches you, then I feel like I can say that we love you, even if it don't. You know, he's got a loving heart, a heart for God. I love seeing the way God's working through him. And more importantly than us loving you, I want you to know that God loves you, and I want you to know that you're worth it. And I want to thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Recovery Couch. Stay tuned next time, and God bless.
Yeah, bless you guys.